How's it going, everyone? This is Max.
And I'm Matt, and today we're going to talk about one of the greatest video game mascots of all time.
And one of the best games on the system. This is Sega Saturn Saturdays. Sega Saturn was one of the greatest men to walk this earth. He would persuade, find, and track down boys, girls, parents, and anyone alike if they did not play Sega Saturn, and find them and hunt them down until they did, or beat them to death otherwise. Well, maybe not to death because they had to play the system.
But some commercials might disagree with that. Have you seen the one where he kills everyone in a nightclub?
Wow.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
He also blows up a guy while fighting over Saturn Bomberman.
Wow. This is the greatest person ever. Like, there's no way to provoke people to play video games through a commercial besides physical violence. And the fact that you're an amazing Japanese karate man does not hurt either. He looks like Akira, kinda, from Virtua Fighter.
Yeah, in a way. Maybe like 20 years older.
Yeah, I guess. But Sega Saturn was one of the greatest marketing schemes, or essentially mascots, in video game history. Like, we have guys like Sonic the Hedgehog and Mario and Crash Bandicoot to an extent for the PlayStation, but Sega Saturn was a dude that loved the Saturn so much he would pummel anyone that didn't play the system. So lead us into a little bit, where did Sega Saturn come from, and where was he popular? Because I don't remember this guy very much at all in the States.
Well, actually he never was in the States. And that was kind of one of the reasons the Saturn got, so much popularity as it did in Japan, because it had a very successful marketing campaign. Rather than just kind of rely on one-note jokes for each commercial, they had a running theme. Sega Saturn was kind of born out of this idea that this guy trained in the mountains on playing Sega Saturn day and night, and he went around the countryside of Japan and beat you up if you weren't playing the Saturn. That's kind of the gist of it. He got his own music video, courtesy of, I believe, Time Warner Music in Japan, and by the end of his reign on the Saturn, he actually got his own video game for the Sega Saturn.
How glorious of a man.
So, Sega Saturn was basically Chuck Norris before Chuck Norris became the sort of internet famous celebrity star that he is now. Basically, this was the guy who could do no wrong. He could roundhouse kick baseballs.
I got it. Chuck Norris is the son of Sega Saturn. He's not even Japanese.
I guess so. This is really kind of the only way to look at it. But it was a great marketing tool because you kind of never knew where he was going to show up next. He could show up in a back alley, beating up boys for not, playing Sega Saturn. He could show up inside a family's home at Christmas time dressed as Santa, and, he would rip off the face like, Mission Impossible style and reveal himself and beat the shit out, or maybe not beat the shit out, but give the kids a Sega Saturn. And there was even a few funny commercials where he was battling zombies for House of the Dead, and then there was one where he was frolicking through cherry blossoms with a girl dressed up as the main character for
Sakura Tyson.
For Sakura Tyson. So you kind of never knew what he was going to do, but it was always funny. It was always entertaining. Some of the more famous ones is like chucking a guy off a cliff and he explodes for Saturn Bomberman.
That actually happens if you throw men off cliffs.
Yeah, exactly. So this is one reason why the Saturn had such a huge success in Japan. Now, the problem was they didn't really know what to do for marketing in America. And if anyone remembers the mid-90s marketing gimmicks for video games in America, they were actually kind of terrible.
What's a Sega Saturn?
I mean, beyond that, they had the god-awful purple polygon-headed man for the PlayStation, which they dumped right before release of the system.
That brings back so many memories, it hurts.
They had their whole slogan for the PlayStation, which was "You are not," and then a big "You
are not ready."
Yeah, you're not ready. Haha, get it. So even though the PlayStation was successful, I can't imagine it was because of their awful slogans and marketing campaigns. Be that as it may, though, a year after release into the Saturn's life cycle, they actually hired on one of the men responsible for the PlayStation's early success, and that was Bernie Stolar. Bernie Stolar was probably not the best man for Sega, especially the Saturn, which again was a 2D powerhouse, because Bernie Stolar had a very strict set of rules, and one of his biggest rules was no 2D games and no RPGs.
What an asshole!
Quite.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
So, Bernie Stolar kind of royally fucked up because the Saturn was kind of built on 2D games and RPGs. That was its like bread and butter. That's the advantage it had over the other systems.
And like we were talking about in the previous episode, the Saturn was like 3 parts 2D, 1 part 3D for the most part.
Yeah.
And 2D games what was designed for.
He also put himself in some kind of bad light with Sega fans because long before the Dreamcast was even out, he announced at E3 unceremoniously that, oh, the Saturn's not our future. Basically telling everyone who bought the system, just like, a mere couple years into its lifespan, that, hey, you guys got ripped off.
Gee, thanks, bro.
So,
really.
But before all of that shit hit the fan, there was one game in particular that kind of blew everyone's mind when it first came out on the Saturn's launch. And that, of course, would be Panzer Dragoon.
I have a copy of the game. Conveniently, let's fire this thing up and find out what made Panzer Dragoon one of the most amazing console launch games in history. Alright, so the title screen and the opening to Panzer Dragoon starts with a bunch of history and text on screen. This might not have been the best idea for a launch game, but they were trying to do something here. They were trying to set up some lore. They were trying to go into a little bit of the history that's behind this game, which is what actually came to be some of Panzer Dragoon's best following. Like, the amount of, like, interpreted history in this game is huge.
Yeah, that's one of the, interesting things about Panzer Dragoon. One reason I like it is because it was so different and it was so daring. I mean, you're getting, of course, like a block of text here, and the intro is like fucking 10 minutes long.
Nothing's blowing up, you're not shooting anything. Nothing's happening. It's kind of like you would never do this, and you can tell that they were taking challenges. They wanted to create an adventure. They wanted to make a big story, and to be honest, this cutscene goes on for like 15 minutes. So there's a lot of history with the game. They actually try to involve a lot of plot for what essentially is a rail shooter. Like, that's all the game really is. So let's go ahead and fire up the game itself, because this goes on for a long time, and if you guys have the chance, check out some of these cutscenes because they are available on YouTube. And listen to the music here. This music is absolutely amazing. There's like a full orchestra going on behind Panzer Dragoon and a launch game. And back in the day, this was like almost unheard of, right? Like, what games
this was a big deal for this game because it had a very unique symphonic score that we hadn't seen in a lot of games before. In fact, almost, there were some games that did use high quality audio like this before, but it was showing us what games could be. They could go beyond just the bleeps and bloops and space shooting. It was actually sort of approaching
making games more into movies type of thing.
And it was getting more artistic too at the same time. So
yeah. Well, the frame rate on this game isn't that bad actually. But here we go. Look at those amazing 2D mapped water planes. And to be honest, the depth of, not the depth of field, but the range of which the visuals are going is actually pretty big for this system. This is a launch game, and actually it looks pretty good.
Yeah. And as you can see, it's actually not that like mind-blowing of a game gameplay-wise. It's basically Star Fox, but keep in mind that Star Fox 64 had not come out yet. And all we had before was just the Super FX version of it. So for a 3D rail shooter, this was still actually very new territory.
A lot of the game is a complement of itself. It's like the visuals alongside the good design, alongside the music, and then all the art and the gameplay. Because the game is actually pretty fun. I think down is up and up is down, right?
Yeah,
so
you can reverse that.
It's inverse controls.
But, when you're looking at this, what's interesting and to me very impressive about the old game is that a lot of the early 3D games didn't quite have much of an art style. It was basically trying to get something to resemble its real life counterpart in any way because the polygons and textures were so primitive back then. But even with that limited technology and a system never really designed for true 3D capabilities, we're seeing, a very unique kind of world here. It's like ruins of civilization that are flooded, and we can, we're getting a sense of time and place, and the music is, of course, accompanying that. And it's just all...
It's the fact that they went for something this bold in scale. Like, usually you'd want to go something that already exists. Like, make something happen on a city street because we know what a city street looks like, but they went balls out. They made like completely original dragon designs, completely original character designs, and completely original, well, holy crap. So
yeah,
I forgot there's 3D shooting too.
Yeah, what really separated this from say the first Star Fox was out with the shoulder buttons, you could start using panoramic 3D view. So it wasn't exactly like, oh, I'm only going forward constantly.
I remember back in the day that Nintendo was marketing Super Mario 64 as being like one of the first like 3D open games, and I'm like, this is total crap. I'm playing Panzer Dragoon like right now, and
Right.
it's totally doing this.
Of course, you didn't have 3D control, and that's another kind of story for another day. But Nintendo showed off Mario 64 early, and was touting all that,
Yeah.
feature about it. And what happened was a lot of other companies like very quickly made 3D platformers to beat Mario to launch, and it made Nintendo very paranoid, and they never wanted to like show games early ever again because of it. Not that like Panzer Dragoon took anything from it. Again, if Panzer Dragoon took anything from any game, it would have been Star Fox. But
And this sounds really weird because this is back when games were really trying to innovate with technology, which hasn't really happened, to be honest, in our industry in quite a long time. If you don't consider like motion gaming to
yeah,
be
like motion gaming is kind of like the new thing. But like, it was interesting to watch the rise of 3D gaming because in a lot of ways it was kind of repeating the rise of just 2D and general video gaming and at all, because back when people were first starting to figure out, hey, we can do this and that with video games in 2D, and 3D was kind of like, again, that renaissance experimental stage where people were coming up with like really off the wall concepts and ideas. And nowadays a lot of games play like other things, but there was no precedent or textbook on how to do 3D gaming back when this started. So everything was in experimental phase, and it kind of like it has there's a uniqueness to that.
Yeah, press hold down the button to lock on.
Yeah, you can lock onto multiple targets.
A lot of like references in future video games, like anytime you had a lock-on feature that had lasers, like a bunch of lasers that came out of one area, like I'm charging a laser, it came from Panzer Dragoon. Like one of the best examples I can give is in Lost Planet. One of the big guns in Lost Planet is a gigantic homing laser that looks just like Panzer Dragoon, and everyone called it the Panzer Dragoon gun. The bosses in these games were great. Like the first one is just an open area fight against this gigantic carrier, but some of them get pretty epic, and you go up against some gigantic like creature bosses too. Let's talk about where you could get Panzer Dragoon right now.
Well, right now it's kind of a little bit hard to find a perfect working copy. I mean, they're actually not very rare at all for Saturn, so if you wanted to buy a Saturn and a copy of the original Panzer Dragoon, not going to cost you very much, not going to be very hard to find.
I think if you Amazoned like a pre-owned Sega Saturn, it's going to cost you $35 to $50, and if you want a copy of the game, it's less than $5, I imagine.
If you wanted to if you're into the import scene and you have a PS2, there's a Sega Ages version of the game, but that's going to be a little bit more expensive, harder to find, a little rare.
Taking the nostalgia glasses off and looking back, how does the game fare up in your opinion?
It's actually a pretty decent rail shooter. It's not as intense, and there's not as much mobility as, say, some of the more recent games like Sin and Punishment 2, or other like-minded titles. But on the other hand, it still has, the lock-on abilities and
Star Fox stuff,
and like the rapid-fire shooting. So I mean, it doesn't have like the dragon transformations like they added in Orda and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, and like getting in, I was the same thing. I can't help but think of perspective since I've played the second one and the third one, Panzer Dragoon Orda.
It's not as advanced, but at the same time, it's also nice and simple, and there's not much you have to remember about it. So it's definitely a great play, and again, the music will never get old because it's orchestrated and beautiful, and the FMVs are a little old and grainy and not very detailed now, but they still get the job done much better than if it was like they were trying to do this live action with like blue screen or green screen.
And that's where I completely agree. I like the storytelling. I kind of like the perspective they were taking. The music really does it for me, and as we do these, you'll get to know my perspective and what I like about these old games and its atmosphere. It's the element of the world they're trying to transport you to when you're playing a game, and that's what Panzer Dragoon did really well for being a launch title.
And another thing too is that because it uses a completely unique language, there is no one on the planet who can sit there and say, oh, the voice acting was really crappy in this game.
You don't know if it's crappy.
It doesn't matter. Like you could be fluent in any language on the earth and you'll never complain about it because it's its own language. It's wonderful that way.
That's some next level Sega shit going on for a launch title.
So yeah, and if you really want to see what a video game would be like if, say, Miyazaki ever designed a video game, especially like late 70s, early 80s
Panzer Dragoon is pretty close.
Panzer Dragoon is pretty much what it would be if Nausicaa was a video game.
So next time on Sega Saturn Saturdays, we're going to look into some of the more popular genres that were on this system that the Sega Saturn was actually known for, or Sega for the most part, and that's fighting games. And it was one of the first party and one of the original 3D fighting games, if not, I think, the very first as well, and it's Virtua Fighter. So we're going to look back and find out what made Virtua Fighter 2, and its awkward spin-off, Virtua Fighter Kids. Why did they make that game?
I don't know. They probably saw what Capcom was doing with Pocket Fighter and thought, hey, we need to get in on the action in 3D. But yeah, Virtua Fighter is kind of the granddaddy of 3D fighters. It may not be the first 3D fighter. I don't think it is, but it's definitely the most popular, and it's still functional and somewhat playable.
Yeah, we're gonna find out how it plays against the modern fighting game. But until next time, this is Max.
And I'm Matt.
And thanks for watching Sega Saturn Saturdays.
Sega